Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the guitarist, composer and songwriter. It is Knox Chandler, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about Life, Love, Poetry and also his album, his solo album, The Sound, which has just come out, and I will put a link to his website in the notes below, so you'll be able to find out how to hear and acquire such a copy. Has worked with lots of people, including the Psychedelic Furs, Siouxsie and the Banshees, Cyndi Lauper, etc., etc. Hundreds, in fact. Anyway, after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject that was the early formative years. Knox, it's over to you.
Well, probably early on it was the music of Stravinsky that my parents were playing. And then I wound up living in Cambridge, England around the very early part of the 60s. Like 61, I think I moved over there.
Right.
And I like it was yesterday, I remember hearing the Beatles on the radio for the first time. And I was just jumping up and down the bed. I've never heard anything like it. And that blew me away. And then we moved back to the States. And I guess it was really a lot of the usual. Hearing Jimi Hendrix for the first time was mind-blowing. Then following the Beatles, and even once I heard Sgt. Pepper's, that was a whole other thing.
Yes.
Magical Mystery Tour, too. But it was more like Jeff Beck, the Yardbirds, the Led Zeppelin, even Jefferson Airplane, Hendrix. I mean, all these guys sort of had a heavy influence sonically on me. I mean, Jimi Hendrix especially. But then I started finding out where they got their influences from. And that was, then going into like Howlin' Wolf and John Lee Hooker and those Chuck Berry, those guys, for instance.
Yes. And were your parents, were they, I mean, you mentioned some of their kind of influence on you, but were they quite a bohemian couple by any chance?
A bit. They were pretty liberal. My mother was an abstract artist. She's still alive. My father was a neurophysiologist, a researcher.
Right. So that's why you came to Cambridge.
Yeah, we moved around a lot.
Right. There you go. So what was your mother's name?
Caroline Chandler.
Right. So she's an abstract. So was she from the world of Jackson Pollock and people like that?
More influenced by Cy Twombly.
Right, Cy Twombly, indeed. We've seen some of his work in the Tate, actually. I was a child of the 70s, and I remember when I first saw that name, I couldn't help but think of, every time I see it, I think of the word Womble, actually. So that, and Mike Batt, who, recently...
Living in England, the Blue Peter was on the TV, and I named my dog Petra.
Right. John Noakes and Peter Purvis. And, I can't remember the woman's name. Yes, it was a golden years for... So you were in Cambridge for quite a few years then, during the 60s?
Well, about 3 or 4 years, I believe, yeah.
Right. I wondered if you'd sort of had a bit of... you'd ever gone to the primary school with any of the members of Pink Floyd?
No, but I have come across... There was someone I did go to... was at the same primary school, but not at different times. No, I went to... St. Colette's was the name of it.
My God, you've got amazing memory.
Cap, the jacket, the shirt and tie, the shorts, knee socks, and sandals, even when it was snow out.
Yeah, they had standards, didn't they? I remember in the 80s watching, is it Chariots of Fire, and this very sort of odd sort of... Britain is so sort of deep in sort of tradition, aren't they, in class? It's quite sort of...
I got my ears boxed. That's how they punished you. Yeah.
My God, I know it was quite brutal. I know there was it's almost, and it's interesting you mentioned Sgt. Pepper because I had a brother who was older, 7 years older, and he in the 70s he was into prog rock, but he had Sergeant Pepper, which I thought was an amazing album. And I was obsessed with that track, Good Morning, which was on side 2, which I thought,
yeah.
which just had that beat all the way through it, and the lyrics sort of told this story, which I found quite fascinating. And also Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which also had some incredible songs on it. So when you got to 16, were you then back in America? Were you leaving college at 16, or were you going on to university?
I was back in America by 68, 67, 68.
Right. So there you go. So
I was just a kid. So by the time I got back here, I was like 8 years old. So that was 66.
right. So that was it. So then by the mid-70s, what was your kind of musical kind of direction at this stage? Because obviously you mentioned all the guitar greats of the 60s, but the 60s started so well and then sort of finished on a bit of a downer. And then there was a lot of people have problems adjusting to different decades, don't they, in different musical chapters in life. What was your mid-70s like at this stage?
The mid '70s, I became very interested in jazz, and there was a lot of at that time there was a lot of I mean, jazz is such a funny word, but at that time there was a lot more experimenting in jazz, and so there was like John McLaughlin coming out of Miles Davis's group and doing Mahavishnu Orchestra. Like I would go see them play a couple times, which kind of blew my mind. And then there's more free jazz around the New Haven area, which was like Abdul Wadud, Michael Gregory Jackson, Leo Smith, Oliver Lake, and it was a kind of exciting time. There was just music you just never heard before, And then that's also about the time the whole fusion, which didn't really grab me that much. But I was also got exposed to Charles Mingus, who I thought his music just spoke to me. Ornette Coleman, Eric Dolphy, a lot of the guys who were sort of breaking the bebop rules, and then,
Right.
someplace else.
Yes. And when
And
did I was going to say, when did the guitar come into your life?
I was about 7 or 8 years old, and
Right.
I was taking recorder lessons at this church in New Haven on Worcester Square, which is the area where all the very famous pizza is. That's a thing here. And I was coming out of my lesson, and in the church there was a guy practicing classical guitar, and my ears just lit up. It just sounded so amazing, and so my mother approached him and see if he gave lessons. So I studied classical for a couple of years. I never really got very good at it, but it wasn't until when I was about 10 or 11 I bought my first electric guitar.
Right.
And I started taking lessons with a Yale graduate student who's in the graduate school there, music student named Wayne Kirby. And then he exposed me to like the blues and worked on my vibrato and stuff. And I was spent a lot of time just trying to pick riffs off of records. My dad had a old Bogan PA head with a 15-inch speaker that he actually used with his turntable for his stereo, which was really mono. And he hooked that up to the guitar for me, and I just got really into feedback. I mean, I just spent hours feedbacking, just trying to figure out how this electric guitar worked.
God, the neighbors must have loved that one.
Well, it's not in the country, so they're kind of
that's good. Could
like where I
imagine.
am now, I can crank my guitars up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and no one complains.
No, absolutely. What was the first gig you went to, by the way? What was the first couple of concerts?
Very first one was Allman Brothers.
Right.
And that was like right after Dwayne died and right before Barry Oakley died. So it was only Dickie Betts on guitar. And then shortly after that, it was like Frank Zappa, Jethro Tull, Yes, Mahavishnu Orchestra. That was like the early 70s, yeah.
Yes, and how were you navigating? You mentioned jazz and some of that fusion material that was happening. What about the other scenes? I'd mentioned glam rock, but there was prog rock, there was heavy metal, there was that early, I suppose there was pub rock, which then morphed into more punk rock, and then there was the kind of singer-songwriter from Laurel Canyon, and then sort of the early years of yacht rock, as it's now turned. Were you sort of intrigued in any of those scenes?
Oh yeah, always have loved Neil Young since even his first solo album, and Buffalo Springfield. Uh, Joni Mitchell, absolutely. My parents were into a lot of this stuff, so they would buy it, and I would hear them listening to it, and that would catch my ear. Bob Dylan, and then it was always the classical stuff, and I kind of got into a lot of Debussy, Stravinsky, more of that period of classical music. And then, like straight up, I mean, Zeppelin always caught my ear. Actually, the third album, I mean, is probably one of my favorites. That just really spoke to me. The one with the wheel that you turn.
Yes.
Yeah, and then there were other bands around that time. I liked Yes a lot, and King Crimson, absolutely.
Right. So you were sort of definitely, but then, that musical moment of punk, did that sort of interest you at all? The energy of punk, the kind of
Absolutely not. It was funny because there were these bands called the Twilights, and there's another band, I forget the name, and they would hire me to play on their 45s, and because I could play guitar, and but at the time I was more interested. At the time I was studying upright bass,
right.
more into experimental music, and actually I didn't appreciate punk music until much later. When it first came out, I was just sort of like, okay, I get the aggression of it. That caught my ear, and I liked that a lot. And there was a lot of stuff happening in downtown New York, where it had sort of a mixture of that sort of punk with like free jazz and funk, and quite a few bands came out of that. Bands, like Rip Brick and Panic, and the Contortions.
Oh yes, the Contortions.
I mean,
So there was a kind of a jazz rock African fusion going on, wasn't there? There was a
yeah.
no wave scene that was on Z Records. I remember there was a lot of bands and early hip hop with some quite. There was a band called Liquid and N DNA and bands like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
James Chance and the Contortions. So yeah, that was kind of interesting. The New York punk scene was quite different to London, I think. It was much more kind of interested in the experimental and sort of went all over the place rather than being kind of more like pub rock, really. So it was interesting. So what did you study? Did you go to university at this stage and start
Yeah,
studying?
at 76, I went to Bard College and got a degree in performance and composition.
Right. So there you go. There you go. There was quite a few musicians. I think there was a member from the band of Susan, who was strangely called Susan. I think she'd gone to some sort of college for composition and
Susan Springer.
yeah.
Yeah, I know Rob. Rob Poss is a friend of mine.
Right. So yeah, so it would be I think she went to some I don't know, Eastern European country because she liked the work of is it Robert I'm thinking of Wilhelm Reich, who's not a musician. He's quite a theorist in life. Who was the guy who did a lot of silent? John Cage, I think that was it. I think she was quite influenced by him and people like that. Yes. So yeah, you know them. So once you finish, how did you then navigate your 80s? Then were you still sort of looking at music as much more of just a sideline, and you're kind of serious in? I mean, well, how were you, going to develop your 80s music kind of career?
Um, well, I moved to New York City, and I thought I was going to be I thought I was going to do more experimental music, mostly playing that bright bass, doing experimental stuff with that, and I knew a bunch of guys in the city who had this band, and we went into media sound and recorded, and there was a bit of interest, and of course the band fell apart. But all of a sudden, I'm now playing mostly guitar, and more rock music. And from there, it just sort of moved around these different projects. Wound up doing a stint with Swollen Monkeys, which was a bunch of guys I knew from the Creative Music Studios up in Woodstock.
Right.
And all those guys were spinning off and playing with like B-52s, The Waitresses, Psychedelic Furs. And I met a guy named Gary Window who I was a real fan of. And he saw me playing with this group with Dave Buck, who at that time was playing with the B-52s. And Gary was like, "You play guitar like I play saxophone. Let's start a band together." So we recorded an album up at Bearsville back when Alan Grossberg was still alive. Alan Grossman,
Right.
And he was a character. He actually put us in there, and I'm just doing a lot of gigs, and then that album finally came out in '88, and by that time, after the album came out, I wound up doing some stuff with it. That project died.
Was that Dog Face or Deep Water?
He did. There was Deep Water.
Right.
Deep Water was one that I did with Gary. I wrote and co-produced it with him, and then but Gary was the sax player on the Forever Now album, the Psychedelic Furs, and he had actually given it over to Mars Williams who was in Swollen Monkeys, because Gary couldn't leave the country for legal reasons.
Right.
And so that's how I met the guys in the Psychedelic Furs.
Yes, blimey. So you were quite into that post-punk sound at this stage.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I was a fan of the Furs, and then it was somewhere in it was like towards the fall of '88. I was walking around Soho, and I bumped into Richard and Tim, and Richard hired me to start playing on some demos, which later became the Book of Days album.
Right, so you were there. God, that was their 6th studio album. They'd been going for quite some time at this stage, hadn't they?
Yeah.
It's a bit of a tricky one for most bands. I found doing this show, most bands have a bit of a 5-year narrative. They have that 12-month honeymoon period of trying to get a sound together. They might get a single. And in this country, you had John Peel or one of those kind of specialist DJs. And we had sort of 3 weekly music papers, which helped. So there was a bit of kind of interest. And, as you know, the UK is very small, and there's you can go from city to city in a transit van, get some gigs together, and then get an album, and the second album, possibly a third. But then most bands, the third album is the end, really. I think by then they've kind of exhausted them, and their sort of tensions and also lack of money can sort of kill a band. Also, what I found is that music scenes change and tastes change, and often a band can be there on the zeitgeist period if they're lucky, they're doing it, but then that 5-6 years goes and there's a bit of a new scene, and they're a little bit like, oh, actually, how do we navigate this next musical movement? So what was it like with the Psychedelic Furs? Because obviously they had been so big in the early 80s with those kind of songs.
It was great. I mean, they have a very unique sound. I think Richard's lyric writing is brilliant, and plus I really just love the tone of his voice, the sound of his voice. And John is a very unusual guitar player. In my opinion, he's absolutely brilliant. And I just loved playing with him. It was just he created such this incredible wall of sound, and his whole approach to the instrument was the complete opposite of mine. And it was nice trying to be the glue in there between him and the band.
Yes,
but no, I loved working with him. It was fantastic. And the other thing was, during that period, it was after the Book of Days album, we were getting ready to go into rehearsals for that tour. Richard approached me and came over to my apartment, and he was like, hey, you should play the cello. And I was like, what are you talking about? I mean, they had cello on the Forever Now album with Ann Sheldon was playing it, who actually was playing in the Gary Window band
Right.
after that. And then they had a cellist come in to the studio in London when we were there to record a song called Torch. And I guess Richard thought it'd be great to be able to do Torch, that song live, really stripped down with like acoustic guitar and cello, and also be able to cover some of the parts that were on the Forever Now album. And so I was like, but Gary, I don't play cello. I mean, I played upright bass, but that was, I was playing with German bow and cello's French bow, and it's also tuned differently. And he was really adamant. You could do it. You can do it. You can do it. So I went and I got this cello that my sister had that was sitting in Connecticut, and I fixed it up and just tried to learn these parts the best of my ability and got into rehearsals. And I pretty much like to say I learned how to play the cello in front of several thousand people a night. I mean, that's what it felt like, and it was really, really nerve-rattling.
Yes, I would imagine, actually.
But I was able to make it work, and by the time we did the second album, I was writing cello parts and string parts on cello. So it was all my role sort of shifted from being just the second guitarist to actually playing guitar and cello.
Yes, well, it's quite interesting. I can't remember her name. She's in Seattle, but I think she was playing cello with Nirvana on their Unplugged album and then touring with it. And I know she did a project in East Anglia, just down the road here, doing some musical soundscape for some art project. I remember sort of doing an interview, and it was kind of amazing. She got that gig and went on tour with the band during their kind of their height of their fame, really, and experiencing what it's like.
Her name too, yeah.
Yeah, so that was quite. And then after that project, are you then during the 90s, because you're very prolific in the 90s, are you just kind of bouncing from one studio to one band to the occasional live tour?
Yes, I from there I wound up the A&R man, Michael Gillelli at Sony, took a shine to me, and all of a sudden he started like booking me on all these sessions, like blindly. Like it's a really funny one was, who I wound up doing several records with was Darden Smith, who was what they called adult contemporary, very singer-songwriter, guy from Texas, and they hired me to go in to do some overdubs, and I went in there and I set my gear up, and I came with my 2290 and some looping stuff, and and got these amps up, and I had them cranked, and I was just testing out the room, and I look up into the control room because no one was there, and I look in the control room, and then the control room was filled with all these people, and they're like this, like. So I go in and introduce myself, and it was Richard Goddard and Jeffrey Lessing, I think is his name, was the engineer, and Darden Smith. And I hadn't even heard their music. I had no idea what I was there to do. And they're like, wow, that's very interesting. They're like, that's very interesting what you're doing out there. And I said, yeah, okay. And they said, well, look, let's give a song a try. And so they put it up, and I just started doing some more atmospherical type stuff and trying different things out. And for some reason, it just clicked. And that record was Little Victories, which became probably Darden's best-selling record. And
Right.
It did pretty well, because then we were like, it's type of, I go to the movie theater and I go to the bathroom, and I'd hear it in the bathroom being piped in, my guitar, and I'd be like, oh my God, this is what my career has amounted to. But we did some television. We did Austin City Limits, and we did the Jay Leno show, and it was just weird coming from the Psychedelic Furs into that world.
Well, I would imagine.
And from there, Michael and Richard were putting me on these other singer-songwriter adult contemporary records, doing the more what would probably have been covered by a synthesizer, but something about the graininess of a guitar made it sort of stand out a little bit, rather than a stock DX7 sound or something.
Yes, and what was the producer Richard Gottner like to work with? Was he quite an interesting character?
He was very old school. He was, he was a co-writer of "I Want Candy" and a lot of those hits from those days. And he'd worked with the Go-Go's and Blondie and a bunch of different acts. And he was a really good at hearing things. Very old school though, which was interesting. And he pulled me on a bunch of records.
And also on that album, you had Rosanne Cash was duetting on one track.
On which album?
On the Little Victories. Didn't she duet on Precious Time, which was one of the tracks on the album?
Maybe. Could be.
Yes. It depends.
I'm still in touch with Darden.
Yes. Well, I'm not.
He was very supportive of me doing this project as a book.
Yes, well, absolutely. And had you sort of worked on the REM album, Automatic for the People, as well?
That's another funny story, because after somewhere around that same time period, Richard was going down to Athens, Georgia, to work with Peter Buck on a cover of Nick Drake's "Pink Moon,"
right?
Compilation album. And he invited me down to go with him. So I went down as a cellist. And so we were sitting around working on this stuff. And, believe me, maybe I've been playing cello, 2 years at that point?
Yes.
For 3 years. And again, it wasn't my first instrument. So there wasn't a huge amount of improvement on my part, probably. But then about maybe 6 months later, I got a call from Peter saying, "Hey, I want to hire you to come in the studio. That part you did on Pink Moon inspired me to write something similar for this song, and then we'll probably want to get you to come down to Atlanta to record with the orchestra with John Paul Jones." And I'm like, "Peter, I'm not a classical cellist. I am what I am." He goes, "Well, I like what you do. I mean, that's really important. I want that kind of thing on this record." So I went up there and I spent a couple days and I did "Sweetness Follows" and "Monty's Got a Raw Deal."
Yeah.
And they were great. It was great working with them and Scott Litt. And then afterwards, they went on MTV and started saying, "Oh yeah, we got Knox Chandler to play cello on this record." And then immediately my phone's calling to do cello sessions, and I'm like, "I'm not a cellist." I mean, I can do a certain thing on it, which I have a lot of confidence with, and a lot of it is processing it. But if you want someone to actually do a real proper cello piece, then performance, then hire Jane Scarpantoni and I give them her number. The funny thing is, it just kept following me along. I wound up doing quite a bit of cello work with Cyndi Lauper, and Dave Gahan, and it just sort of Depeche Mode. I put some cello on there at one of their records, and just sort of people sort of, "Oh, you play cello? I want to," And at one point, I was like almost ready to get rid of it. But funny enough, I'm glad I kept at it, because I've been doing these improvisation sessions in New Haven Improvisers Collective, playing cello. And it works out great, and I'm enjoying it.
Well, I can remember the sort of 90s where suddenly there was a couple of bands suddenly had a bit of a tiny orchestra. There was one particular band I remember being quite fond of called My Life Story, and they had this it was financially probably a disaster for them, but they had a sound which was, because during that period there was the Britpop kind of movement, and people who were probably fans of the indie world in the 80s, but that was quite niche, suddenly got to that age where when they were in bands in the 90s, it became much more of a mainstream thing, and you had obviously Blur, Oasis, yes. But then, a few bands thought, oh, we'll put, a sort of some cello, some violin, a little bit of a brass section. And I do remember with this one band, suddenly seeing these members of their little orchestra appearing on everybody's sessions on Top of the Pops, or being sort of hired. I think one person went with Brian Ferry and Roxy Music. Suddenly they were sort of being pulled. So there was suddenly a fashion for sort of an orchestral accompaniment happening.
Well, it just gives it another sort of dimension to the sound.
Yes, and people like. I think there is a sort of romantic melancholia to the sound of the cello as well, which gives it a richness and a depth. And you mentioned Nick Drake, but there was a lot of people who, when you hear that kind of, it sometimes sounds quite torturous, doesn't it? People want the pain of it.
And I have people say they don't like it, the cello, because it just sounds so sad all the time.
Well, God, I mean, they didn't grow up listening to Joy Division, did they? So then you then also work on this next project that Richard has, Love, Spit, Love, actually, because I can remember actually getting this album. I think I was kind of curious at the time. What was that project about?
Well, after I mean, Richard decided to end the Furs after World Outside, and I spent maybe about a half a year or so writing for that record, and then once Richard got a deal, what I was told, the record company, and at that time, the drummer from the Furs, Tim, and I, and then Richard Fortas were all working together writing this record, and they got the deal. And the drummer, the record company decided that they didn't want it to be another Furs record because
right.
Furs in it, and so Richard wasn't going to fire his brother. So the drummer and I were let go of, and that's that.
Right. That was disappointing, wasn't it, really?
Yeah, it was a bit disappointing.
It was very disappointing. And what's the next album that had any significance during that period? Because I know you worked with quite a lot at this point, Siouxsie and the Banshees a bit later, didn't you?
No, Siouxsie and the Banshees was 95 when I joined up with them. Right before that, I'd worked on, did a tour with Ultra Vivid Scene. And then I also was working, and I did a record with this Canadian artist named Lee Aaron that actually Reeves Gabrel recommended me for, because he couldn't do it. I think he went in and did like a day of overdubs, but they needed someone to spend time making this album. It's called Emotional Rain.
Right.
Mark Berry produced it. And so I spent some time doing that and the Ultra Vivid Scene tour. And then Ultra Vivid Scene tour I wound up doing at the tail end of my writing with Love, Spit, Love. And then, and so I was doing the Lee Aaron thing after that. And then at the very end of that is when I got approached by the Banshees to go out and tour the Rapture album.
Right. With the Ultra Vivid Scene, because I did an interview with the old Kurt. He, I remember they came to the Norwich Arts Centre. Did you come to the UK with them?
No, we only toured the States.
Right, at that stage. I always remember they went down as one of those bands which were incredibly loud. And most people were sort of, yes, probably still got ear damage ever since. So, yes, Siouxsie and the Banshees came along. And was that Showgirls that you did?
Yeah, I played on Showgirls, yeah.
Right. What was it like?
That was a funny session. We were like, maybe about halfway through the tour or coming close to the end of the tour, and Paul Verhoeven had met Siouxsie in Texas, in Dallas. It was during a really horrible storm they had there. Our show kept on being delayed. And I guess that's when they sealed the deal. So we went into a studio in Prague, and it was it was the funkiest studio I think I might have ever been in. I mean, I was sitting there in the control room, playing some guitar, and I look up the VU meters, and every time I play, all this activity would happen. And we kept getting close. We finally realized it was infested with ants. which is probably why there's all these problems with the lines at times. But
Well, I would imagine that would have been a horrendous experience, actually. I do remember recently I did an interview with I think their first ever, or one of their first guitarists, John McKay, who's
yeah, yeah.
just got an album, and he's going to be doing a live date very soon. I don't think he's done any music for decades, so I think that's quite an exciting new development. What was the atmosphere like with the band at that stage? Because obviously they've been going for nearly 20, not quite 20 years, but quite a long period of time.
It was fantastic. I loved it. I mean, they were great. I really enjoyed them as people and as performers. And, yeah, it was a wonderful experience.
Was it just on that one project, Showgirls, or did you do others?
I did the Rapture. I did the Rapture tour, and then I did. We played, but the Showgirls recording was in there, and then after that, I went to their Siouxsie and Butchie's place in France and recorded the Anima Animus album with them.
Right.
Then I did a little bit of touring around that. The three of us went out, just the three of us, with triggering samplers and all sorts of stuff. And then I wound up going over that's right. Then we did the 7 Year Itch tour and DVD. And then after that, I did the Siouxsie and the Dream Show tour and DVD.
God, yes, that was quite prolific at this stage, actually, wasn't it? You'd crept into the O years at this point, hadn't you? Sort of, yes. And then when you were, because one of the artists I loved during that period was Dar Williams. I can remember her first couple of albums. Did you just play a session?
Quick session? I never even met her, but I almost went out and introduced myself for the first time. She was playing out here. And I was almost wanted to go, crash that and say, I'm Knox. Yeah.
Yes, well, quite. I guess so. Were quite a lot of these, because it's a hell of a discography you've got. Are most of them sessions, or are there any particular ones where you almost collaborate with, the artist as well, or contribute more than just going in, doing your bit, and going out?
Well, even when I'm just doing my bit, I like to think of it as a collaboration. I mean, I'm going there. I want to give them what is me. I'm not the kind of session player who's just going to be, just phone it in. Going top from stuff. I mean, I pour my heart into it. I wrote and recorded and toured the Dave Gahan Paper Monsters record. That was a real collaboration. And then there'd be like some people that I would collaborate on bits and pieces. Yeah. I mean,
so on that album with Dave, Paper Monsters, are you doing the music and he's doing the lyrics, or are you sort of collaborating the whole piece? Because it's all tracks written by Dave and yourself.
I covered most of the music. I mean, he had opinions about stuff, and he played a little bit of keyboards on some things, and harmonica. But I when we were writing, I would come up with these tracks, and then he'd come in and come up with his melodies for his vocals and the lyrics, and we'd hash them out. I would say I would give him my opinions about the lyrics and the way he sang the vocals. Like,
right.
He had a tendency to quite often, in my opinion, oversing. So I was always trying to get like more vulnerable Dave in there. And then he had his very strong opinions about the music too. So it definitely was a collaboration. But as far as the musical end of it, I mean, I played most of the instruments on the record. We brought in a couple drummers and a pianist, and then I did some string arrangements for it, and we brought in some string quartets.
Yes. Did you record that at Electric Ladyland?
Yeah.
Yes. What was that studio? What was that studio like to work in?
Oh, it's great. I've done a lot of work there, with different artists.
Yes. I just watched a film documentary on Electric Ladyland about how they developed it and created it. So it's a kind of a fascinating vibe, really.
Yeah, it was a good vibe, very good vibe.
And
I mean, it was,
did you go on tour with Dave with that particular
yeah,
period?
I did.
Did you do Glastonbury? Did you come over to London?
Yes,
Well,
I did. Yeah.
what's it like playing a festival, by the way?
Well, that's the thing. Festivals, it's not your show, really. I mean, you don't have, you're not getting just your audience. People aren't coming just to see you.
No, absolutely.
So that's one thing, which is a good thing. And you're outside, and I think that was a daytime show, so you're missing your lights, and you don't have the amount of time to sound check properly. If we even did sound check, I think it was just a line check, and so you're having to deal with things not being up to your standard as if you're touring theaters or whatever. But it's exciting because you get to see a lot of people who are doing out there, touring also. And
Yes, absolutely.
camaraderie. I like the feeling of festivals. I think it's a good vibe. And
Well, Glastonbury's got a lot of history to it, so it's got a lot of depth, hasn't it?
but then you also wind up. We did this one festival in Italy, and it was hot. It was like dusty, and it's really hot. And I think they even had the oxygen tanks on the stage. And I was surprised David could even move, because he really likes to spin around and do all that stuff. And I was like, well, I could barely move. And we went on right before Bon Jovi. And the crowd was just shouting Bon Jovi, Bon Jovi during our whole set.
Yes, that must have been rather.
We could go the other way too.
Yes, not such great times. I remember a few years ago doing an interview with a producer, Mark Saunders, and he talked about a very English producer to begin with, and then went over to America to do some work, and had quite a lot of kind of interesting experiences working with various people, which were not always that great. People like Marilyn Manson he found weird, but he also did an album with Cyndi Lauper, which slightly traumatized him. What was it like working as a musician with Cyndi?
Apparently, it traumatized her also. He didn't like talking about that album. I think it was 12 Deadly Sins. Was the name of the album. And I actually wound up working with him on another product with these British folks that came over.
Right.
And I got to know him a little bit. Cyndi was such a weird thing. It was, she has a reputation, as you know, and I think there was a couple times when someone said, "Oh, Cindy's looking for this, Cindy's looking for that. Should I put your name in the hat?" And I was like, I'm kind of busy, and I really didn't want to start working in a situation that was going to be difficult. Then I finally got this phone call from Sammy Marandino, who did all the drum programming on that Darden Smith album. And we had remained good friends and worked together and done a lot of writing together. And Sammy had a studio over in the meatpacking district, and he called me up and he goes, "Hey, I'm here working with Cyndi Lauper, and I hear your thing on this, and she wants to hire you to come in." And I was like, okay. And so I brought my rig in. I brought the cello, the guitar, my rack of sound stuff, and I get in there, and she's not there, and we wait for about an hour. She still hasn't shown up, and Sammy goes, "Well, let me put the tracks up, and why don't you just have a play with it?" And so I put the tracks up, and I started, just doing some overdub stuff on it, some mostly like atmospheric-y, loopy kind of things. I thought give it a little bit of flavor, and maybe a few things here and there. And pretty much that didn't take very long. And then about a couple hours later, she shows up, and I never met her, and she's like, "Hey, buddy, pal, I'm Sim," And I go, oh my God, it's just like, you've seen, it's just like, really? You got to put on an act for me? But it's really the way she is. I come to find out. And Sammy going, oh yes, Sin, you should hear this stuff he put on. It's really cool. And she just blew up on him. How dare you touch my music? I'm the producer, this and that. I know exactly what I want him to play. And I'm just like, I'm shocked, I never, like, whoa, it's not that bad. And so she did. She told me exactly what she wanted me to play, and didn't even listen to what I did. And then Sammy and I had a gig at CBGB's Canteen that night, and she shows up, and she sits there and heckles me for the whole show. And I'm just like, oh my God, this woman, it's just, she's that crazy, it's like, she's exactly what one would think she is, And I said, I'll never hear from her again. And it was a couple weeks later, I'm in the studio working with Victor Van Vogt, and my phone starts blowing up, and I'm not paying any attention to it. And finally I'm like, you know what, I better answer this after like the sixth time trying me. And because I didn't recognize the number, and my son was at that age, he was in school. I thought maybe it's the school calling, and I better answer it. I answer it, and I'm like, hello, and it's like, hey buddy, hey pal, which was my name for years. I don't think she ever could get my name straight. Hey buddy, pal, we're sitting here mixing this stuff, and the engineer pulled up these tracks, and this is amazing. Sammy didn't wipe the tracks. And so she was hearing the stuff that I did before she even showed up. And she said, I want to fly you out to LA this weekend. We got this television show, and then I want you to do the rest of my album and all this and that. And that was the beginning of that. And when we got in the studio doing the album, it was my role was very experimentative, It was really cool. I got to do stuff with chaos pads. I even was able to pipe an accordion through my rig and do stuff there, and, some wacky stuff, and that over the next 10 years just became less and less, and mostly down to about 3 cowboy chords and a Gretsch guitar through a Vox.
Yes, God, it's got to be done. I know it was. So yes, you also had quite an interesting experience on that one, didn't you? As well, really. Was she?
It just shows that. I mean, for me, no matter what music it is, I like to bring a part of my personality into it. What my approach to it would be, and a lot of the times it works, and sometimes it just doesn't. And that's fine. I'm not really, I'd rather be like, okay, we're not going to use it, and thanks for coming in, than trying to be the person they want me to be.
Yes, absolutely. And was there sort of, after that sort of period, were there any other kind of collaboration albums that you worked on during that period? After that period.
Well, I was working. The whole thing with David happened. There's a period where I was writing the album with David, demoing all that stuff, working with Cyndi, and working with Siouxsie and the Banshees. So that was 2002.
You're right.
And that was there was just one night I woke up, and it took me a good while to figure out who I was playing with and what country I was in. I remember looking around the hotel room. Well, it's definitely not David. That was tough. I mean, I always would dabble with some pet projects with people, and I did some collaboration stuff with Bethany Yarrow, Peter Yarrow's daughter.
Right.
I did a couple. We'd collaborate a bit, and there was some period where I was doing a lot of collaboration with these New York DJs, and there's just I was always pretty busy doing something, and when I wasn't, I was really trying to be a good dad.
Yes,
son.
And then
Sorry?
And I was going to say, and then you also worked with a woman called Lizzie, who I sort of remember sort of having a period of thinking, God, she's going to be amazing. I think she still is. But was that much of a collaboration, or did you just get brought in to do just an odd track or two for that?
Is that?
Lizzie, she did an album called Castles with her. Did you?
I don't think that's me.
Oh, right. It's on your discography, that's all. And I thought,
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Okay, then that is me. There's a lot I don't remember.
What?
I mean,
and people like Jess or Jess Mayland.
Jesse Malin, I played cello on one of his records.
Right, The Fine Art of Self-Destruction was another one of those, wasn't it? So yes, so that was that. So then sort of coming up to the kind of present day, you've got a new kind of album that is coming out, haven't you? The Sound. So when did this project start to come about? Because a lot of people seem to be digging deep into their work. As I mentioned David J earlier with his kind of new album. So when did The Sound happen?
Well, it's actually the product of something. I would say to go back to 2012. I'd just come off of working with Cyndi for about 10 years. And I wound up doing some film stuff. I did a bunch of work on the Greetings from Tim Buckley movie and did some independent films scoring, and wound up going over to Hong Kong to do a couple dates with Budgie from the Banshees. This very interesting project with Siouxsie and Mabi. And it was a couple nights at the festival hall there. And Budgie had just moved to Berlin. And his wife was there also, and they were talking about how great Berlin is, this and that. And so I went back to New York, and around that time I was just really not really doing anything super interesting musically, and I've been jumping from this one project to this other project. They always end, and I really want to get back to where I was around the time I was graduating college, where I was more focusing more on experimental stuff, pushing the sound barriers a bit. And I also had to move from my apartment, and I couldn't find any neighborhood in New York I wanted to move to. My son had grown up. So I was on the phone with them, and they said, well, you should come to Berlin. And I was like, well, you just had a baby. And then his wife got on the phone and convinced me into moving. So I just basically packed everything up, sold everything, threw away stuff, put what I wanted to keep in storage. And I went there with a guitar, a backpack with an iPad and a computer and a suitcase. Didn't bring any stomp boxes, didn't bring any of my outboard gear, and I was like, okay, I just want to really start from scratch, and I want to get into working in Ableton Live. At that time, I was also dabbling with Max MSP and Jitter, because I'd been doing some solo shows where I was creating these soundscapes and projecting these films I'd made. A good friend of mine, Peter Freeman, who passed away a couple of years ago, and we did a lot of work with John Hassel as a bass player and producer, and I considered him my technical mentor. He was pushing me to start experimenting around with class-compliant iPads,
right?
Where you use the drivers and the interfaces. And he was designing a app that's now called Looperverse, which assimilates the Electrix repeater, which was a looping box that I had used. I used it all over Paper Monsters. David Torm was really into it also. We both were beta testing it. And all these other apps. And so for the first 2 years I was living in Berlin, I really focused on how to create this world that I'm sort of hearing in my head, this thing where I'm processing the guitar to a deeper level, and that's what I did. 2 years I spent trying out all these different apps, working in Ableton Live, and finally I pushed away the computer. I got tired of having a computer on stage. I thought if I could bring it down to an iPad, that would be great. And at the same time, I started experimenting with processing video clips and mixing and processing them in this VJ app called TouchViz.
Right.
And through doing this, I kind of found a world that I really like to live in. And I started I called it Sound Ribbons, because somehow it just had this ribbony quality to it that, it's not really, and I can wrap this ribbon around some of this sound and nurture it and move on to the next thing. And somehow it just seemed to fit well with what I was doing. And I started going out and doing solo shows with that. And it just, for the next, 13 years, it just developed. And so getting back to this project, Peter Freeman, who turned me on to this whole thing, he was really pushing me to do a guitar album. And so that's what this is. There's this album has no synths on it. It's just guitar, upright bass, and percussion. And every single piece starts out with a sound ribbon. I create these sound ribbons, and then from there I deconstruct them, I edit them, I add, but the original thing is the sound ribbon, which is what I started working on, 13 years ago.
Blimey. God damn, that's really interesting. No, because I've been sort of playing it, and actually the visual that you did for the track Tea Stained Edge, I'd sort of had a filmmaker, a friend called Martin Sercombe, and it was quite similar. To the imagery that you had on that video to the work that he was doing at times, which was quite kind of reminded me of his pieces. So once you created the sound, then did you start to create the visual videos to accompany those pieces?
Okay, so what happened was 3 years ago. But I came back a little over 3 years ago. I came back here to see my mother after COVID, and she lives in this is beautiful old farmhouse, 1840 Federal, with barns and ponds and streams, and I couldn't understand how she was able to maintain the place, and I couldn't figure out how she even did her grocery shopping, and I made a decision, and I said, well, I think it's about time I moved back in and take care of you. And she was, oh, would you? And I said, yes. So that's what I did. I gave up my life in Berlin and moved back here. And, I set up my studio. And then another friend of mine, Sue Jacobs, was really pushing me to do some painting. Because I had another project that I had already recorded that she thought I could really attach some paintings to it. So I started doing that. But somehow I was very disconnected from what I had done in Berlin. And I wasn't connecting to being here. We'd sit there and be recording these sound ribbons and be like, something's weird. It's not working. Very uninspired, but still pushing myself to do the work. And so what I started to do, I was like, okay, I got to get outside. Starting to be springtime. So it was 3 years ago about this time. I started getting out and taking hikes. And I live right on the Sound, which is Long Island Sound. So I go down there and I hike and I fish, and I took up fly fishing. So I was going into rivers for about 7 hours at a time. And somehow that process of hiking and mostly being in water for 7 hours and just observing the rhythms of the water, I was getting this inspiration. And my artwork was sort of going in that direction, as well as the music. And I realized it's all very much connected, including my journal writing, my photographs, my sketches. And some of that earlier stuff wound up becoming the pieces that are on the album I did with Bobby Previtt Chandler. That's on Subsound, that came out in February. But I finished that record, and then it was pretty much the past year I was like, right, I really got to make this guitar record that Peter was pushing me to. But the inspiration is really coming from nature. All my inspiration, it's like where it used to be from the streets of New York or the streets of Berlin. Now it is actually coming from like fly fishing or night fishing down on the Sound, or I don't know, it just sort of just magically or whatever, it's naturally happened. And talking to some people, including Darden Smith, you know, because he put out a book, and I said, well, I feel I don't want to put out an album, because I don't know a lot of people with turntables who actually would, you know, I mean, there's a crew, but I don't want to put out any CDs. But I feel this project should have something tangible. And he was like, "Yeah, do a book. You know, you should do a book," and a couple other people too. And so I decided I'd do a book, but it's a book that's more like a memoir of the past 3 years, documenting the shift from urban to rural inspiration.
Yes. So on that book front, has that been published now, or is that getting published?
No, I'm putting it out myself. That's it. I'm not. I'll be selling it through Bandcamp, my website, and probably Spotify too.
Right. My God, that's all good. So with the, you know, when you sort of put together like a track like the Tea Stained Edge, did that all, so you made all that and you created all that while back in the countryside of Connecticut? Yes. And did you then sort of, when did you start putting the film together? And were you the person that was filming and then sort of editing this kind of piece as well?
It's all me. I designed the book. I, you know, did it in InDesign. I make all the films in Premiere. The photographs, you know, Photoshop. Even my logo for the record company, Blue Elastic, I did in Adobe Illustrator. I mean, it's just been it's a big learning curve. It took a lot of time, and they're all images around the same time as making the track. And some of these, I'm always out filming stuff, and it's all stuff that I'm finding around this area, either down by the water or around rivers, or even on the property here.
Yes,
and the paintings too. A lot of the colors, you know, I was sort of trying to get the connection to that with some of the real close-up shots of flowers I do, and so there's a sort of this richness I was finding in nature that was not only what one would say is beautiful, but also the decay of nature. And Tea Stained Edges sort of exemplifies this sort of this edginess with decay.
Yes,
as well as the harmony of beauty where it opens up to.
Does that symbolize, I mean, at the beginning of the video, you've got these two lines, and then you've got either, is it the sun or the earth that you've got in the middle of that shot that sort of then changes?
It's not the sun, and it's not the earth. It is what you want it to be.
Right.
If I told you what it was, you'd laugh.
Fair enough. It's fair enough. I know. Well, I've tried following it along and sort of thinking, well, you know, and there's kind of clips of you know, like, because I'm from the countryside, so there's kind of wispy grass and there's kind of rivers and there's bits that are changing and moving. I just kind of, and I wasn't sure whether one should read too much into it or whether it's just more of an abstract piece that you can just kind of enjoy with this sort of sonic soundscape.
Well, there is sort of a storyline with the actual sphere, you know, and how it moves through these different landscapes. I think for me, it's so much part of it is trying to connect technology to nature in my own abstract way. Like there's sometimes I go for walks and look at nature, or I'll be meditating or something, and I will see something completely differently that's in front of me in one moment as opposed to the next. And this is sort of me pulling that the more abstract stuff that that's percolating inside of me out, and because the sources is all natural. The same as the instrumentation's all natural.
Yes,
but it's been definitely processed and and there's been a technical side of it, and I think there's a lot of focus I have on trying to keep it, even though it's electronic, but making it sound as natural and organic as possible, or at least for me, be able to feel like this is true nature, even though it's electronic. And I feel I was very successful with that. And I had the same process with the book, like even the cover. This is a jellyfish,
right?
And not processed. This is a jellyfish that was sprawled across a rock when I was fishing, and I took a photograph of it, and I was like, to me that's like an incredible painting.
Yes,
I wish I could do.
It's interesting. I was just going to say, there's interesting how many artists I've interviewed and have somehow gone from cities into the wilds. A lot of people around the Joshua Tree area and in desert. So you're not in that landscape, but you're definitely gone into much more of a rural location than you used to. Has that sort of all sort of affected your musical kind of appreciation?
Well, this is the house I grew up in, up until I was 18 when I left. From 13 to 18, I was in this house. So I did a lot of exploring, spent a lot of time outside in the woods and all that stuff, doing drugs and growing weed and whatever. So for over 40 years, I'd been in a city. So coming back, it was a double-edged sword. I mean, I hated being back in my hometown in the house that I couldn't wait to get out of. And, not really connecting with any of the people here. I mean, this town is really beige, vacuous of all culture, but awfully pretty. And so coming back here was it was a big step for me and emotionally. And then taking part in the actual earth around here. And then I have a fascination with the Native Americans and reading about them and the tribes. There were like 16 tribes that existed here, and how this was a very plentiful area with the sound where you could get clams and oysters and fish and the rivers and the deer. It was pretty. It's pretty lush.
Yes.
And so it just took a while to actually fall in love with nature for the first time, or being an adult and feeling it for the first time. And that's what took me down the path. So, and as far as the book is concerned, I'm looking at it the same way as I treat the music. It's very much collage oriented in some ways. It's also processing something that is natural as a flower and doing something with InDesign or Photoshop to create this other beauty that I see in it that's just not obvious at first. Like a lot of the images are even the back cover is bark. But even stuff like this is very, very much they're photographs, but it's all been sort of processed electronically.
Yes, my God.
And the writing in it is done in freehand, and it's just my journal writing that I was doing at the same time as making the music and creating the artwork.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there was another artist that I did an interview with probably this year or last year, and his latest project is about places that have a particular feeling for him, where and they're all very individual to the person, but has kind of written this album connected to places and spaces, and how's that affected him. And I guess it's something that perhaps as we get older, sort of those kind of, I don't know, connections or closing the circle, if you want to get cosmic with it, start to sort of have a bit more significance in our own consciousness.
Well, but it took it. And I've always done this from all the touring. I've always come across places, and I was like, "Oh, this would be a great place to come and do some writing, do something creative." The issue with me is that it takes a long time before I really understand a place. I mean, even though I lived here from 13 until 18, coming back, I just didn't know the place. Like it was like coming back as in my 60s as opposed to being a teenager. It's like I had to really learn and understand, actually sit in it, to be able to make a connection where I could feel creative.
Yes, absolutely. And with the album, they've all got.
Sorry.
I was going to say, with the album, they've all got sort of titles that are very related to, I guess, your environment that you're living and working in.
Yeah, yeah.
It all makes sense.
It's basically I'm documenting the past 3 years. I like to call it a musical memoir.
Yes. What does 3 Days After? What's the story behind that song or track?
It was the 3 days out after a specific event that happened, and it was totally the feeling I had. It kind of tells us the story of sorrow with touches of light. Yeah, I think with any sort of human experience, I mean, there's especially ones that are really trying, that there's some adversity to it. You're dealing with some adversity. It can almost, it's so easy to go down the road of just like, really dark and, that's it. But some of it isn't so dark, and some of it's more melancholic. And then I find that over time there are these moments of things that come out, that actually give you contrast. It gives you contrast to your day, and it gives you contrast in the music.
And also sort of interesting to see how one responds to these times or those moments which aren't always that easy or makes one feel uncomfortable. Because you can find a lot about yourself in those kind of difficult periods or moments than when it's kind of easy.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting. So what? And then Tea-Stained Edge. What's the kind of, again, just briefly, what's the story behind that particular number?
It all came out of some improvisations. It all started with a sound ribbon, and then I experimented with playing some bass around it, and then the main guitar is a character, and it's actually funny enough, it's a character that is still very much attached to the popular world. So there are actually some popular references in it, even though it's very abstract. But it's also dipping into the contrast of this beauty and this decay. I mean, it's I've always been, there was a period, and there's actually a couple in the book. I think I'll see if I can find it. Where is it?
It's always the way.
At the end, that's what I'm saying.
Aha.
Here it is. Like some of these images here.
Yes.
Like quite often I will take a piece of paper and I'll stain it with coffee or tea. And there's a period in Berlin where I made a whole series of these pieces that were all done that way. And it reminded me very much of my kitchen window that looked out onto this wall that had this decay, which would have these certain patterns in it, these certain images. And then seeing it, being around here, seeing it in nature, like there's so much composition within this vast world of just leaves and trees and clouds, etc. But I started seeing composition in all this stuff, thinking. I mean, and it boils down to like even the that song Mars on a Half Moon Rising.
Yes, that one.
That one all began with there's this pond right outside on the porch here, a wraparound porch, and during the spring and summer, it's like a symphony of frogs. And I went out there with a field recorder and recorded about 5 to 10 minutes of it, and I just started listening to it over and over again, and I was hearing a piece of music. I was hearing a composed piece of music. It sounded like a symphony. There are all these parts where it die out and start up again, and then I mean, I was just to me, it was just magic. And it's sort of the same thing I often see when I can look out the window and notice this dying tree over here against these beautiful flowers, and that type of contrast. So I then sat down and started doing a sound ribbon with it, and then I just listened to that endlessly, and then the melody came out of that, and it came out. It's an ode to Mars Williams, who passed away about a year and a half ago. He's a sax player in the Psychedelic Furs, and he was someone who I had been very close to and done projects with over the many years. I've known him since '77, and I was feeling his loss, and I just came up with this melody, which I actually scored out. It's probably the only time I really score anything out. And that became that song.
Blimey, God, I'm gonna have to go back to all these ones, aren't I? And then sort of a track like "Flower Under."
Yeah.
What was this sort of the story behind this one?
Well, I think it was slightly influenced by my a period of interest in mushrooms and researching the network that they have underground between them and trees. And
Yes.
but it also I looked at it more like it being a kind of a nod back to my classical composition days, where I was trying to create this sort of shape where it developed, and there's sometimes a bit of a recapitulation, slight recapitulation, but there's this is one moment where it just sort of, it's the guitar that just turns into, like, it sounds like it's a section of could be a section from La Mer or something. It just sort of, this wonderful magical thing happened during my experimentation, and I was like, oh, this is perfect sense.
God, it's just extraordinary, actually. The whole piece, actually, and then just kind of Burn. This is
it's one of my favorites too.
Which one, Burn or
Flower Under is one of my favorites.
Yes, fantastic. And Burn. What was the kind of, how did this particular piece come about?
That's that comes from more of a feeling of being on edge. I went through a lot of losses, and I was feeling a bit of the burn from the losses. It was about the time. I mean, I worked a lot with. I did a bunch of stuff with Anton Fier, a couple Golden Palomino albums.
Yes.
Some other albums, and he had passed away. And I'd also had worked with Jamie Branch, the trumpet player, on the Mars Williams Albert Eiler Christmas. We had toured a couple times together, and we were good friends. We stayed in touch, and she passed away. That's the album. Branch is a dedication to her.
Right.
Greatly inspired by seeing her perform in Berlin right before she passed away. It was just a mind-blowing show. So the burn was, it can mean quite a few things for me, but it's and since it's the edginess before the melancholic loss. That makes sense.
Yes, the slight.
There's a few.
Is it an emotional kind of resignation, not resignation, but a kind of like acceptance at that point where there's no point.
There is, absolutely. I think that's it's acceptance of the uncomfortability of some unresolved feelings is what it best is. Because sometimes I don't listen back much to the record, but when I do, sometimes I go, yeah, I feel differently now than when I made that.
Yes. It sounds like a sort of, it's been an important album to work through, to for a lot of things for you to process at the same time.
Yeah, I mean it comes out of me being a caretaker to my mother for 2 years, which meant, I mean, I'm not a caregiver. I'm just not wired for that, but I had to be one, which consumed all my time. So a lot of this, like that, most of that Bobby Previtt album was done very late at night after she went to sleep. But once my mom moved out, which was a year ago, it just freed me up to really focus on making this. And so a lot just sort of came out. It's like a lot of emotion came out. It wasn't the easiest thing caring for my mom, and it was actually quite difficult. And and there's just been so much loss. So many of my friends have passed away, and I've never really fully have grieved them. I mean, I haven't even fully grieved Gary Window's death, and then there's like Hal Wilner, who died like about 4 years ago. 3.5 years ago.
Yes, well, I kind of see that with my parents, who are still thankfully with me and doing it, but they're really at that stage. But when I go back, I mean, every conversation is either about a hospital appointment, doctor's appointment, or they're going to a funeral, and they come back with a order of service, and which I'm always curious about to see what songs they played and what hymns they chose and all that. But if I ever go to sometimes they like to visit the graveyard because that's where their parents are buried, but they also know everybody in this graveyard, and I think. And I think, God, how do you deal with that? Literally, you knew all these people, you grew up with them, you went to school with them, some of them, you were in that community, but they're all here dead, and you're still hanging in, and it's just like, I used to freak out when one person died every other year, but then suddenly you're thinking, well, you have to deal with it all the time, so. It's a weird one.
I've lost probably my 5 closest friends in the past 3-4 years, and it's yeah. I mean, it definitely affects you. So maybe part. I mean, the album is dedicated to these people, and I feel that their influence on me, Jamie, Mars, Peter, Hal, Anton, my working with them brought out another thing in me that I didn't know was there before, and which I utilize to this day. So in a sense, it's like bringing that all together with this whatever you want to call it, a rebirth, or it feels like once my mother moved out of here, this whole thing just shifted, and I got the whole house to myself. There's the art studio, there's the music studio. I have friends coming out. Like I'm working with Cynthia Slay from the Bush Tetras on a project. She comes out from New York and stays a few days, and I can put people up. It's a beautiful place. And there's no distraction. Like if I was in New York or Berlin or even Woodstock, New York, where there's a lot of people around, there would be that distraction. And here, there's not that distraction. It's kind of isolating, but I get a lot more work done.
Yes, and it's probably quite nice to escape the news.
Well, yeah. We won't go there.
No, not at all. With a piece like this, once it's coming out, will you be doing any live dates or any shows at all?
I have been doing some shows. I was in Berlin. I did 3 shows. I did a show a couple of weeks ago in New Haven. I got some shows coming up. When I perform live, it's the Sound Ribbon show. So it is with the visuals, the projections that I'm manipulating, and also the sound ribbons. And one of my rules is the part of the liminal space is I don't use any pre-existing audio. So everything is created on the fly, and it's all coming from like one source, being the guitar or cello or trumpet or whatever, and no samples, no synths, and that's the show, and it's demanding, but it's what I love to do, I mean, I really enjoy getting lost in this thing. It requires a certain amount of focus, but when it's good is when I get lost.
Yes, I
And
was going to say the focus must be enormous.
and sometimes I add like other instruments.
Amazing. And then with you've got the book. Do you have any? And then you mentioned Cynthia from the Bush Tetras. So is that the next project that is going to be coming out?
We'll see. We've got probably about 8 songs, and we'll just keep writing until we feel it's time to pick from a bunch. I have that. I have another project called Blues, Not Blues, which is with Rick Moody. Then I have a project with Eric Mingus called Bursting Bluebone Bark. That album has been mixed and mastered, and I'll put that out sometime. And then I have another solo record called Sea of Stars that's been mixed and mastered, which I'll put out.
Blimey. So are these mostly on your own label now?
Yes. And so what I will, on my own label, I mean, everything, I'm looking at everything at an extreme grassroots label. That's what I should have called it, grassroots label. It's the first time I've done anything like this, so it's all been a learning process. Even down to the software, learning how to make a book. I'm just sort of taking it like one little step at a time.
Yes.
So the help I've really gotten is by hiring Howard to do the publicity.
Oh yes. Good old Howard. Yeah.
Which I was trying to do by myself, when finally someone who was interviewed me said, "You got to get a publicist." But I figured I'm looking at it like this. I'm 66, and I'm trying to figure out what I really want to do with the rest of my life. I don't see jumping up and down stage singing "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." I feel like I really got to focus on what I originally was interested in music in the first place. And I think I also need to try this out on my own and learn as much as possible. I need to make mistakes, and they need to be my mistakes.
Yes, I think that's it.
I've fallen down. I've fallen on my face a few times already, and that's great. I'm quite happy. The truth of the matter is, I feel really good that I accomplished what I set out to do. And it's as good, if not better, than I expected, on both the musical side and the book side.
Fantastic. Well, I know from was it Brian Eno was when he was talking to David Bowie about doing Low. He said, "Look, let's just experiment, and no one's going to die, whatever we do. We're not flying a plane, we're not doing surgery, we're just making an album. So let's not worry about what happens. Let's just immerse ourselves and take risks." And it's Low. So which everyone hated at the time, but now he says it's their favorite album.
Also Bowie that said, we don't create to the audience.
Yes, well, I think that was the time when he said that, that's when you make your worst mistake, is when you're trying to work out what they want, the audience, and give it to them, rather than saying, "This is what I've created. If you like it, great. If you don't, then no one died." So
and that is truly what I've done here. And the thing that happens when you do that is you put yourself in the most vulnerable position possible. It's like it's all out there. It's I feel incredibly vulnerable, but it's like I don't look at myself as a great painter. But yeah, my paintings are in there, and I'm happy with that. That's who I am. I'm not a writer, but my writing's in there. I'm quite happy with that. That's who I am. And I'm not the best guitar player or the best composer either, but it's truly who I am, what I did.
Yes, well, as Neil Young said, you know about his career and his choices. He followed his muse, which I guess is just his instinct and his gut. So that's when he would just make those kind of dramatic changes. But then, within that, you make that great work. So you just have to go with it, don't you? But you have to be true to yourself, and then you know that you can sleep tight at night.
Yeah,
I guess so.
At some point, I mean, there was throughout I'm very grateful I had the career I had, and I got to play with so many people. Each one of them was a learning experience, and it really taught me about working with others and how to conceptually fit in a project that was very different than where I came from. So there's a lot of vulnerability on my part during that time period, but it's always been some kind of compromise, you know. And I sort of feel like there was a lot more for me to say, let people really know who I am, you know. And I think this was a good representation of who I am.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you ever so much for your time, and yes, and getting to hear your album, which is always amazing to hear. So yeah, and when I put this out, which will be very soon, I'll send a link to Howard, and then he'll hopefully be able to send it on to you, and you can use it on any of your social media platform sites and everything. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine, perfect.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for your time. I'm going to go to bed now, and but yes, have a great day and or evening, and yes, I'll keep in touch. But thanks again for your time.
Thanks, David.
Take care. Bye-bye. I'll hit end. Indeed, it's always good to hit end at one point. Anyway, look, massive thank you to Knox Chandler for that interview talking about his new solo album, The Sound. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on all those social media platform sites. Just do C86 show and my name. It should be fine. Also, all these fascinating interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes and Podbean, plus various other ones. Anyway, enjoy. Have a great week. Stay safe.